Forced laborers. Nearly 7 decades after Japan's occupation of Korea ended, Korean courts are handing aging victims a string of legal victories as a troubled history between the two countries becomes a growing source of tension, undermining modern bilateral relations.
In a landmark ruling that could influence similar cases brought against Japanese enterprises by forced wartime laborers, a Korean court on this Friday ordered a Japanese steelmaker to compensate 5 Koreans.
They were forced into labor in their early teens during Japan's 35-year-long colonial rule of the Korean peninsula.
And to tell us more, we connect live with our Park Ji-won at the news center. Hello there, Ji-won.
Hi, Ganyang and Daniel. Yes, Korea's Gwangju District Court on Friday afternoon ruled in favor of the 5 individuals who had filed compensation claims against Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The court ordered the Japanese firm to pay the victims of forced labor some $140,000 per person in damages. The 5 women, mostly in their 80s, were forced to work for the company without pay for nearly a year and a half in the mid-1940s, right before Korea's liberation from Japan. The victims were in their early teens at the time, a violation of the international human rights norms of the era. The victims filed a compensation lawsuit against the Japanese government and Mitsubishi back in 1999 in a Japanese district court, only to have their case thrown out by Japan's Supreme Court in 2008. Well, at the time, the Japanese court said individual compensation claims had already been settled in Japan's reparations package of $800 million to Korea in 1965, when the two countries restored diplomatic relations. However, Korea's Supreme Court ruled last year that the reparations deal does not preclude individuals from claiming damages. So these 5 victims finally received a winning verdict in a Korean court on Friday, 14 years after filing their compensation lawsuit against the Japanese firm.
Right, Ji-won. However, this isn't the only case surrounding Koreans forced into labor during Japan's colonization of the peninsula. Now, other cases are still pending in Korean courts. Am I correct?
Yes, Kanyang. Well, actually, this is the 3rd case in which victims of forced labor have won compensation claims against Japanese firms in a Korean court, where earlier this year, the Seoul High Court ruled in favor of 4 other forced laborers and ordered Nippon Steel and Shumimoto Metal Corporation, previously known as Nippon Steel Corporation, to pay 4 former workers 100 million won, or about $94,000 each in wages and damages. In the same month of July, the Busan High Court ruled in favor of 5 other victims of forced labor in their compensation claims against Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Well, however, the Japanese firm have appealed those rulings, and Korea's Supreme Court is still reviewing the cases.
Okay, so Ji-won, do rulings in Korean courts have a binding effect on Japanese firms, and what are the ramifications of the ruling?
Well, Daniel, it's a little complicated. If the Japanese companies refuse to comply with the Korean court's final ruling, the plaintiffs can ask the companies' assets to be frozen in Korea or in 3rd countries. These companies have Korean branches or hold shares in some Korean companies, so there are ways to receive damages from them. The companies could also voluntarily decide to pay damages on their own, taking consideration the public relations effect of such a case. The Korean government says an estimated 150,000 Koreans were forced into labor between 1910 and 1945 when Japan colonized the peninsula. Well, many of them have died, but experts say at least 180 other victims of forced labor during Japanese colonial rule are also planning to file a compensation suit against Japanese firms in the future. So we can expect similar lawsuits to follow.
Right, and the verdict this time could be used as a precedent for those lawsuits. 70 years too late, but better late than never, right? So thank you, Ji-won, for that report.